Hi, and welcome to the latest Facebook Live from RANE. My name is Emily. I am a senior Middle East and North Africa analyst here at RANE, and I'm speaking with my colleague Charlie, who is a global security analyst here at RANE, with a focus on a lot of things, but Middle East and North Africa certainly a particular topic area. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about Iran, an update on the protest situation there, as well as just discuss more of the sort of regional and global implications of what we're seeing on in Iran and related to Iran. So I wanted to start off by just pointing to the most recent trigger that we've seen related to the protests that are ongoing in Iran that's been getting a lot of mainstream coverage, and that is this rash of executions of protesters who have been charged well, really, they've been charged with this sort of broad act of this broad charge of acting against God, a charge that usually carries a death sentence. Most of the protesters who have been executed have been charged with having killed a member of the Iranian security forces, most often the Basij militia force. And this is generating a lot of attention because it's connected to this really firm pattern of crackdowns that the Iranian government is doing against these protesters, who, of course, have been protesting for months now, on and off, related to the September killing under police custody of Mesha Amini. And so, really, as we've been talking about this in the Middle East North Africa team, there are a few big questions. One of which is, how long are these protests going to last, and what is the political impact going to be? I think first, maybe just thinking on the sort of tactical level, Charlie, when you're looking at these protests, and what are sort of the things that are top of mind for you as you're looking at the domestic security situation in Iran over the coming months?
Well, so over the coming months, the biggest things in terms of the domestic security situation in Iran, I'm looking especially at unity of security forces. Are the security forces remaining unified in their approach to the protests? So far, they have been, and so that's pretty much kept a lid on a potential regime collapse or regime stability issues writ large. But how do they continue to remain unified over time? Do we see splits between the IRGC and the Basij, or do we see splits between, more importantly, the IRGC and the Artesh, the Iranian army, that could spell more serious trouble for the Iranian regime domestically? Another thing I'm looking at from a security perspective is, how do the repeated crackdowns affect the protest movement? Does it stay a nonviolent movement? Do we see the growth of violent groups getting essentially fed up with the repeated crackdowns and the protests and decide, we're not going to stay a protest movement, we're going to start undertaking essentially terrorist operations or guerrilla warfare type operations that would um, greater increase the risk of violence across the country. One of the things that is rather interesting to watch from my perspective is the ethnic dimensions of where protests are happening and where they're occurring. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that and how that kind of plays into maybe the more political side of things?
Yeah, sure. So, the concentration of protests across the country over the last few months, since mid-September, it's you've really seen protests across all provinces, intermittently, sporadically, but most of the concentration has been, of course, in major cities, including Tehran, but also very much in the northwestern region of Iranian Kurdistan, which is where Mesha Amini was from, and where there are these sort of long-standing grievances against the government. Iran is a really diverse country, and one thing that we've talked about internally when we talk about the geopolitics of Iran is, the current modern government, the Islamic Republic, that's been in place, since the 1979 revolution. They have struggled off and on to exert control and to maintain the stability of all of the sort of peripheral regions and minority occupied regions of the country, that are especially sort of around the peripheral areas of the country outside of that urban core of Tehran. All that to say, it is likely that we continue to see unrest in the northwestern Kurdistan region of Iran. And a really interesting question um, to ask is whether there's a possibility of any sort of spillover or transnational ties sort of growing or changing in any sort of way between the Kurdistan region of Iran and the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Um, the Iranian security forces a couple months ago were pretty heavily monitoring and even shelling areas across the Iraqi border after having accused uh, Kurdish groups in Iraq that have connections to Iranian Kurdish groups, accusing them of sort of fomenting unrest in the Kurdistan region. It's very likely that the unrest that they were seeing was more of this grassroots unrest that was related to the anger against the government for the death of Masha Amini, as well as other issues that are sort of longstanding and that periodically pop up. But there is a possibility and a chance of an aggravation in the tension between the government of Iraq and the government of Iran over the coming year if we do see any sort of transnational militancy develop and pop up. And I mean, while we're thinking about uh, the sort of issues related to Iran that are outside of Iran proper, it's probably wise right now that we talk about what's been going on in terms of growing tension between Iran and Western countries, Iran and specifically the EU and EU member states. And what we're seeing right now is sort of a growing push within the EU and among some EU member states to sanction Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC military force. And we've talked a lot about this internally and how there could be several sort of knock on effects if the EU does decide to sanction and list the IRGC as a terrorist entity, which of course the United States did under the Trump administration in 2019. I, I want to say something about what that could look like politically, but then I'd love to know what you think there could be in terms of any sort of security impact of that. But I think politically, what we're watching for is we're thinking about the EU-Iran relationship and this sort of growing tension and this deterioration in their diplomatic ties. One is the potential degradation of the communication channels between the foreign ministry of Iran and the foreign ministries of all these EU countries related to anything, sort of commercial trade, basic security cooperation, counterterrorism. And Iran is not a country that a lot of Western countries have, like deep security cooperation with, but there is an extant channel of communication that they use and that they will use to discuss a whole host of diplomatic and security and economic issues. And if the EU were to sanction the IRGC, which is a very important component of the government in Iran, and increasingly so over recent years, there is going to be some difficulty in communicating on just about anything. There's going to be a huge block, a huge barrier in the communication between Iran and these EU governments. And this, I should mention, before getting your perspective on the security situation, because of this, the drivers to this are one, the crackdowns on protesters within Iran connected to the anti-government protests and the sort of EU member states saying that the IRGC is closely linked with cracking down on these protesters. There's also concern that IRGC-linked plots abroad to arrest or harass dual nationals, that the threat of that is growing. And then there's a whole host of other issues that are aggravating tensions, including Iranian weapon transfers to Russia for use in Ukraine, as well as the simmering issues related to Iranian nuclear proliferation and other sort of issues like proxy militia groups across the region. So all this tension is sort of coming to a head and could result in sanctions. But I am curious what you think we should be watching for in terms of security for that reason.
Okay, so I think from a security standpoint, how Iran responds and the security threat it poses is going to depend largely on the action the EU takes. So if they designate one or two individuals in the IRGC, the Iranian response is probably going to be more proportional to that, to that designation. So they're more likely to perhaps designate EU officials individually, or take other smaller scale steps. We might see an uptick, for example, in low level cyber attacks, for example, or more, I would say, more harassing kinds of activities. There would also be probably an increased risk of hostage diplomacy incidents as EU citizens visit Iran, or EU dual citizens visit Iran. But then we can go up the scale to what if the EU designates a whole entity like the IRGC, for example, as a terrorist organization that's on the table. So in that situation, we'd probably be seeing a more um, escalatory approach from the IRGC and from Iranian proxies. So we would be talking about more Iranian plots within Europe targeting especially dissidents, Iranian dissidents, dual nationals. We've seen, I believe we saw incidents in like Denmark and Sweden where they attempted to go after uh, opposition figures in exile. We've also seen attempts to attack Iranian dissidents in France in exile in recent years. So those are kinds of part of their menu of options. And then in addition to potential attacks abroad in Europe, there would also be a greater risk to Europe for European companies and major European brands working in the Middle East writ large. I'm thinking particularly of in Iraq, where Iranian proxy militias are very active and remain very active against U.S. interests. So we could see Iranian-backed militias conducting, say, for example, rocket attacks on European embassies in the Green Zone, for example, or attacks that target European forces that are co-located with Kurdish forces in northern Iraq is another potential, or attacks on if there are European interests in oil fields in southern Iraq and Basra, for example, we could see a renewal of attacks like those. So they've got a whole menu of options for response that they could use. We could also see developments in the maritime domain. So the Strait of Hormuz and shipping. There have been off and on attacks by Iranian, likely the IRGC naval units targeting oil tankers or other bulk shipping containers in the Gulf. So those are all things that I'd be watching for in a more escalatory scenario.
Yeah, that all makes sense, and, I think that's probably I know we've only just barely opened the, sort of can of worms that this subject is, but, we should probably wind down the conversation there, and,
Yeah.
um, but you can find a lot more of our coverage on Iran and other geopolitical issues at rainetwork.com. Thanks for joining us.